Bottomline Africa, right here on KTN News. And let's start from here in Kenya, where Wiper Democratic Movement leader and NASA co-principal Kalonzo Musyoka has slammed calls by the diplomatic community asking the NASA leadership to recognize the presidency of President Uhuru Kenyatta. Kalonzo was addressing supporters from Mavoko constituency who paid him an impromptu visit. The Wiper officer said the NASA movement ideology is in the minds and hearts of their supporters, thus forcing leaders to recognize an illegitimate government will not work. Now, the Wiper leader says the diplomatic community cannot push leaders to recognize what was blatant electoral injustice. Let's listen to what he had to say verbatim.
Ati mabalozi wanasema kwamba tukubali. Tunakubali kweli? Hey. Na mimi nasema hata mimi kama Kalonzo nikikubali. Hebu sikilizeni. Mimi kama Kalonzo nikikubali na Raila akubali. Je, wananchi ambao wanajua waliibiwa kura watakubali kweli? Kwa hivyo jui nini mambo ya wananchi wa Kenya? Wananchi wa Kenya.
Now, it's about time we start our studio discussion. Of course, it's lined up with what the NASA Deputy Leader, Kalonzo Musyoka, has been talking about. In the studio, once again, I have Professor Israel Kodiago, who's the Africa Regional Director, Southern Delta International. We also have Kefo Ojuju, who's a lawyer and doubles up as a political analyst. Good evening, gentlemen, and welcome to the show.
Good evening.
Let me quickly go through the statement in question here that was released by a section of foreign envoys during the weekend that has elicited a lot of reaction, especially from the opposition. Let me quickly go through some bits of it just for the sake of our viewers. And they started by saying a father of multi-party democracy has made unsubstantiated claims about elections and unilaterally sworn himself as president in deliberate disregard of the constitution for which he so proudly fought. I believe they were talking about Raila Odinga there. The statement continues saying that the government, which should be the guarant of liberty and freedom of expression for all under the law, has shut down television stations, seized the passport of opposition leaders, refused to obey court orders, and deported a prominent opposition lawyer. These events followed two elections that left many Kenyans dead and many more livelihoods disrupted. And this is what has elicited a lot of reaction, the last bit of it, where they said the opposition must accept the decision of the Supreme Court to uphold the election of October 26th of President Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto, and they have to recognize them as the legitimate president and the deputy president of Kenya. The opposition needs to accept these as the basis for the dialogue that it and many Kenyans want. Stalking and threatening violence are not acceptable. Kefa, let me begin with you. Good evening, of course, and it's always good to have you on the show. Let me begin with you. First of all, do you agree that, or do you feel that the foreign envoys have a role to play when it comes to democracy, not just in Kenya, but the continent as a whole? Because this statement seems to be like giving orders, literally.
Sorry, come again, Yusuf. I didn't get you clearly.
I'm saying from the statement that was issued during the weekend by the foreign envoys, apparently, it seems like they're issuing orders, for the opposition to recognize, President Uhuru Kenyatta as the legitimate president. Of course, they've also criticized the government for, disregarding some of the court orders. So let me begin with this. It's a question that we have posed to our viewers earlier. Do you believe that they have a role to play when it comes to local politics?
Thank you very much, Yusuf. Yusuf, if you look at the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, which Kenya is a member via the Article 2, 5, and 6 of the Constitution, you realize that a lot of envoys we have in African countries have actually lost the mandate, which is spelled out in Section 4 of that convention. Number one, Yusuf, is that if you look at that convention clearly, you realize that one of the roles that the foreign envoys are supposed to do is to act as arbiters, is to act as, as negotiators between political parties within a country, or where there is a political interest and even economic crisis. But then you see, you cannot act as a neutral arbiter when in the eyes of so many Kenyans or so many Africans, you've already appeared to be partisan, you've already appeared to be biased from the word go. You remember the history that we have with the foreign envoys. I don't want to go far, right? But I just want to go prior to the 8th August the election which we had. Remember, these are people that came openly on international media and even the local media and stated that the elections were free, fair, and transparent and were conducted according to the best principles of international practice. But remember, when we moved to the Supreme Court, it was nullified, and it was a big shame to them. You also realize the events that occurred after the immediately the elections were nullified, prior to the 26th October elections. You remember the stand position that they had taken, that even when the chair for IEBC and Roslyn Akombe had came out clearly and stated that even them, they were not in a position to hold credible elections by them. Mm-hmm. They insisted that for them, they had surveyed the system, they have looked at the formalities that were in position, and they were convinced that the IBC was properly, prepared to conduct free and fair elections. So you wonder then, what is the interest that they're championing? Why do we have then to take partisan, positions? And then you insist that Kenyans must follow the law. If you want Kenyans to follow the law, if you really mean good for the Kenyans, you need to start by the highest office. You see, because...
Yes, Kefa, we'll talk about interest shortly, but you agree with me that they have a role to play, but they're supposed to remain impartial, right?
They have a role to play, but all the roles that they play are clearly spelled out if you look at that convention, that they're supposed to remain neutral and impartial in all the acts they do in this country. Mm-hmm. Because they are not, they are not supposed to take sides. They are not to seen like, being biased to the citizens. They are supposed to champion the international agendas. That is to unite, African countries and the Western countries as one.
Let me engage Professor Kodiaga. Do you agree with a lot of critics of these foreign envoys that they're out there to champion their own interest at the expense of, democracy in a country like Kenya, perhaps? We're going to go continental shortly.
Thank you, Yusuf. I think even before we look at the issue of whether they outstepped their mandate or not, it's critical for us to understand the basic element of foreign policy. And a country's foreign policy basically is that which determines her relations with other countries economically, politically, socially, and even militarily, and to some lesser extent, non-governmental organizations. Now, that policy leads us now to the determinants of, now having defined it, now we go to the determinants of a country's foreign policy. And there are basically three. And that is the matter of goals or objectives of that particular country. And two, the aspect of leadership. And thirdly, power. When you look at all those, now we cascade down. We cascade down to what now are the roles, or rather, what are the stated policies. And the stated policies go up to about 12 of them, but I'll give you about 5. For the example, we have the area of prevention of areas of cooperation, we have prevention of disease and healthcare. We have areas of prevention of poverty and involvement of the private-led enterprises. We have the areas of against terrorism. We have the areas of promotion of shared values in democracy, good governance, and human rights. And of course, now that aspect of the shared values of democracy and good governance is what now brings us to this discussion. So there are about 5 areas, but this is what brings us to the discussion. Now, you need to go back into memory lane, and you'll discover that it all depends on which side of the divide you stand or you belong. One, in the 80s, the late 80s to the early 90s, we had envoys in this country, and we had the famous Nyamachoma envoy, Smith Hempston, who was actually pro-democracy and was standing with the opposition then. At that time in place, he was a hero. And over the years, we've had times when the envoys have worked with or hand in glove with the opposition. The point in place is the envoys come to this country to represent the interests of their country. It is
and that means whether they're going to support the opposition or the government. So where will that leave these foreign envoys in the eyes of, the citizens, perhaps?
I'm coming to that. So the first thing that you must bear in mind, and even if you read America's definition of our foreign policy, it's all about our interests and for the benefit of the American citizens, both in America and wherever they are, and they are partners. So by and large, you must bear in mind that the envoys are not here for our own good. They are here for the good of their countries.
I think you've delivered your point there, Prof. Now, allow me to engage Kefa. Kefa, there are some tweets here we're getting. A viewer is here saying that sometimes it feels that, these foreign envoys use stability as opposed to fair and just elections.
Very true, Yusuf. You realize that the personality or the way these envoys operate is, it's below the standards which have been set for them. They are required to, to operate in a means that is persuasive and objective. But you realize that in most of, in all the times, they normally even engage the opposition. You'll realize that they've always been seen to become assertive and combative the way they operate. But Yusuf, it is important to note that these people do not have the interest of Kenyans or Africans at heart. Now, in 2007, even when the country was burning, you realize that the current, the former envoy, the state envoy we had, Michael Renneberger, insisted that the opposition had to recognize that the former president, Mwai Kibaki, was, legally elected as the president, even when it was clear and the country was burning, because they knew they had an interest that they had to achieve. Now, remember in 2014, what happened in Uganda, very interesting story, that all envoys pulled out and said they do not want to associate with Uganda just because Museveni signed anti-gay bill into law. You see? And you realize what the events that are also taken place right from 8th August up to the 26th, after 26th, even up to last week, what has been happening in the media. You realize that it is not about the law. It is not about the human rights that are fighting for. It is not about the respect for humanity. It's not about the respect for conformity of what we have in the nation. It is about their interests. Because if you are clearly want to ensure that citizens and state organs abide by the Constitution and the laws, then you'll be the first person to condemn the state officers that do not even conform, disregard court orders. We've not even heard them talk about that. But then now you want parties, you want individuals who are grieving, individuals who feel that they lost elections unfairly, to start, in fact, you're imposing on them that they must recognize the person that they're supposed to be dialoguing with on issues, on electoral matters, that they must first, recognize him as the president. That should not be the question. The issue should be, we have a crisis here. What is it? Let us sit down. Let us look at the reaching point. But you see, when you already come from a standing point that first you must recognize that this is the president, you've already taken sides, and you cannot be a neutral arbiter.
Yes. Now, Prof, there's a viewer here at Marchel who says, those are the perks of taking huge loans from these nations. Debt trap diplomacy also makes them overstep their boundaries by getting involved in our political affairs. Remember, when there is chaos, it still favors them economically. Do you agree with this view that because Kenya and by extension African countries continue receiving a lot of aid from these foreign countries, so it gives them the liberty to give directions, as this statement alludes?
Absolutely, and in fact, that's the point I was going to advance further, that they are here for their own interests. So it would be an exercise in futility for the opposition or for anybody else to assume that the envoys are here for the good of Kenyans. In the current scenario, it is very clear that the envoys went to bed with Jubilee a long time ago, and that was long before the 26 elections. And you could see clearly that given that the election was basically a rubber stamp election, the 26th of October election was a rubber stamp election, it is therefore an act of contradiction on the side of the envoys to demand from the opposition and other Kenyans, who almost half the country, who believe quite sincerely that President Uhuru Kenyatta did not win the the presidency legitimately.
But, Prof, there's a ruling that was made by the Supreme Court then.
We are not talking about rulings. Rulings, we know how the Supreme Court was actually subjugated into making those rulings. What we are saying is that the envoys went overboard by demanding and stating in black and white that the opposition must recognize President Uhuru Kenyatta to have been the legitimate president, and two, that any negotiations thereafter can only come once they recognize that.
Yes.
That, to me, was beyond their stated mandate. All they needed to do, they could still be in bed with Jubilee, there is no problem, but the problem is, by making such utterances, they have now polarized the country. They have now demonstrated clearly that they are not interested in peace, they are not interested in stability, because what they are doing, they are basically putting a bandage on a wound. The need here is to actually get down and treat the wound. And the wound can only be treated if we admit that that election was a sham. The wound can only be treated if we admit that this country is now badly divided. The wound can only be treated if we admit that unless and until something is done, we are heading for a big disaster very soon.
Kefa, the foreign envoys made a very long statement during the weekend, and of course, the one that was highlighted by so many people when they asked the opposition to recognize the legitimacy of the president. But the statement also very deeply criticized the Jubilee government. With them apparently the little disregard they have for the rule of law. So why those who might say the opposition is a bit overreacting?
Yusuf, I want you to look at the energy, the vigor in which they criticize the government and the vigor in which they approach the opposition. And then you weigh the two. You realize that when they criticize the government, it appears like just, a cover-up. It appears like just a flower being shed out. But you realize that when they're attacking the opposition, they're very combative and they're very assertive on what they're saying. Now, you see, for me as a lawyer, if you move to a court of law, for instance, and then the judge is supposed to listen to both parties, both the plaintiff and the defendant, tells the defendant that first, you must accept that the plaintiff is right, then we start from that point. In other words, the matter is already settled, you see? So when the envoy tells the opposition that one, you must first declare or you must first accept that the president is the president of the republic, that is what that was, elected free and fair in the ballot. You're already telling them that first recognize that the process, the electoral process that you are claiming to be wrong or you are claiming to be, defective is good. Then you start arguing from there. So in other words, you've already settled the matter that these people have. You've already settled the grievances without hearing their side. Well
said, Kef. I think that will sum up as your final comment. Prof, where will this leave foreign envoys moving forward? I mean, these are people representing various, especially European countries. So where will this leave their voice or their credibility, perhaps, in the eyes of Kenyans?
Well, we are not going to talk about their credibility because in the last several months, the American ambassador has been almost operating like a Jubilee Secretary General, shuttling between Jubilee offices and NASA offices back and forth. And you could listen to him, you realize he was more interested in buying time with the NASA as opposed to solving the problem. In fact, rather than worry about the envoys, I think the burden is with NASA. And I think NASA should not waste any more energy complaining and making noise about the envoys. The envoys left them a long time ago. And in fact, what I would advise now, because Jubilee is happy with what is happening, and that is what should happen anyway with them. But for NASA, they also need to get organized. Grandiose statements and grandstanding is not going to take them anywhere unless and until they have a strategy on how they want to capture power. I am not sure whether they do have it. And all I would advise NASA to do quickly is, one, either take steps that will ensure that that so-called swearing-in which they conducted was indeed a swearing-in and not a mock swearing-in, regardless of the consequences. And two, if they cannot do that, then they should go ahead and play the role of opposition in parliament and be vanguards in areas where we are seeing the government going against the constitution, against the law.
Yes, Prof. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and
Yes.
I'm sure we're going to have another show where we're going to discuss on what NASA perhaps is going to do next. But unfortunately, we're out of time, and of course, definitely we're discussing the role of foreign envoys in Kenya. You've seen there are different opinions here, especially on social media. I'm going to go through some of the feedback shortly, but for now, I believe it's about time we look at the images of the day, and in our images of the day, a work missing for decades, which has been referred to as the African Mona Lisa, is going